during the last 20 years, the most dramatic thing that's happened in relation to carers, because when we talk about carers, it's highly gendered, it's women, actually. And that's the key thing about carers. So there are, obviously men are carers, but if you look at caring as if you look at what we call dependency work, it's highly gendered. And because it's highly gendered, it's very low paid, because women do not get good salaries. So even if a man is doing that, it is low paid work. In the last 20 years, the middle classes in this country really haven't had any increase in income, curiously. Very odd, but it hasn't increased. The way households have survived in the last 20 years is that women have gone back into work, and there's been a 14% increase in women in work. So in the last 20 years, you've seen women having to go back into work, part-time work. You've seen the state pulling away services. And therefore you've got, Anne was saying, things are stretched. Well, actually what's stretched are carers, because they're largely working and they're taking the strain from this cutback. And my view is that they're stretched as far as you can go. They really are as stretched as far as they can go. And the state can't carry on those two games much longer. I'm writing a paper. I often used to say, I've just finished this paper, but I'm being honest now, I haven't finished it. But I do have to finish it because I'm doing a big presentation on it, called Does Your Carer Take Sugar? Because it's mimicking a radio program some of you will know that started in the 70s called Does He Take Sugar?, which was about disabled people. And it was a very provocative title in the 70s, because in the 70s there was a sort of stereotype about disabled people, that they were crippled people that sat in the corner and you talked about them because they couldn't possibly talk for themselves or make decisions for themselves. In the 70s, the disabled people's movement was getting going. It was getting going because of Vietnam, largely. A lot of highly educated, reasonably well-off people coming back who were conscripts in Vietnam, coming back injured and getting very cross. And there's a classic image of the philosophy they adopted then. They were angry, they felt that they were excluded, and they started saying they weren't disabled because they had no legs. They were handicapped by the environment around them. And the classic picture for that is a book cover by somebody called Michael Oliver called The Politics of Disablement. It's a man in a wheelchair, and in front of him is a flight of steps, and at the top of the steps it says polling station. Because he couldn't vote, not because disabled people were incapable of voting, he couldn't vote because of the environment we're creating. Once you've got a radicalised group of people who self-associate, who feel oppressed, and they have a philosophy, you then have a radical movement. In the 70s, we never expected the disabled people to become protected under the disability discrimination legislation, but then 20 years later they got an act. Now they have a UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. They have become the objects. And what I'm saying in this article is carers are in exactly the same position today. They are oppressed by the social conditions. They're oppressed by neoliberalism, by countries that believe you can take away the safety net of the welfare state, say there's only one route out of poverty, and that's work. And that catches a group, it catches carers. They have to look after them. And they're becoming radicalised, and they're seeing that, in fact, their quite severe social exclusion, because 500,000 of carers in the UK are some of the most socially excluded people, is being caused by not science or inevitability, but by the sort of structures we have. So carers are the political group. They are the fascinating group, and they are beginning to identify, and they will be given very clear protection within 3 or 4 years under the equalities legislation. But what I'm going to say today is that they already have some protection because we've moved that way. So that's the big picture. If you're employed in carers work, you've guaranteed a job for the rest of your life, because the government knows that's the group of people you've got to say nice, honeyed words to. You've got to pass bits of legislation that sound nice, because they're the group that are really stretched, and they're getting a bit cheesed off with that, I think. So, there's Trustee Sir William. Now, one of these great acts was the National Assistance Act. It's an act that is often overlooked. But it's an act that I like very much. It's the only one of those statutes that's still in force. All the others have been modernised, codified, but the old National Assistance Act is still there. Why do I love it so much? I mean, the Law Commission recently told me that I'm the only person they've ever come across that likes this act. The act's got some bad things about it. It uses some sort of naughty language. It talks about crippled people, handicapped by congenital deformity. It uses medical model languages. But it's a great act because it does two things. One, it says that once a local authority's decided you need something, it's got to provide it, full stop. It's got to do it. So it packs a punch legally. Once you've been decided you need something, it's got to be provided, full stop. We'll see that local authorities are massively short of money. They are massively short of money in social care. So they play all sorts of naughty games. I'm sure they don't in Shropshire, but in other counties they do all sorts of naughty things. They have waiting lists, they have panels, they have all sorts of things that they're not allowed to have because the law says once you've decided you need it, you've got to do it. That's a great thing. And the moment there's a bill going through Parliament that will change this, it's to codify it, hopefully, but hopefully it won't take that away. If we've got time, we can talk very briefly about that bill, because that bill is going to make quite significant changes to carers' law. The government says that it will improve things, but I distrust governments. And so I think we all need to be very aware of this bill. It's called the Care and Support Bill. Yeah, sorry. Please interject as well. Yeah, but thanks, Liz. The other thing that's great about this act is that I do a master's in social care law at Cardiff. You've got to come. This is a promotional interlude. I've got some leaflets there. But one of the things we do is we ask the students to look at the debates in 1947 when this government is debating that change. It's an extraordinary government in 1947. It's the one and only time in the history of the United Kingdom we've had a government, a cabinet composed of people who had been poor. You know, we had an R.M. Bevan, we had Ernest Bevan, we had Shinwell, people that had worked in the mines, worked in the shipyards, and they knew what it was like to experience the system then, because the system then was the Poor Law. And the Poor Law said you couldn't get any help from the borough council, the parish, unless you could show you were destitute. And to show you were destitute, you had to have no money, you had to be paraded before the justices to show you had no suitable outer garments or undergarments. So elderly people were paraded before the justices and show their underclothes, to show they had no decent underclothes or spare underclothes. But they also had to show that they had no relations near or far who could support them. And so there was what was called the liable family rule, the filial responsibility rule, as the Americans call it. And the Poor Law Commissioners would go far and wide to see if there were family members that had money, children who could support their parents or their elderly relatives or their mentally ill sister or learning disabled brother. And only if you could show that you were destitute and you had nobody that had money that would support you, could you get help. And of course you then went into the workhouse. The workhouse existed, in fact, until the 5th of July 1948. It existed in name until 1933. In 1933 they changed the name, but the institution still existed. And if you listen to the debates in 1947, there's this hatred for that system because the people who were then in power had experienced that. I mean, not personally, but they had seen it. And so we did something very unique on the 5th of July 1948 when this act came into force. We abolished the Poor Law. And with it, we abolished the liable family rule, and there's what it looked like in 1601, because of course the poor law existed since 1531. And it's an incredibly important thing. For much of the world, there is still a liable family rule. But we in this country, because we had this unusual system of the poor law before, we abolished it. And I'm often having to tell senior social workers, I've got a lot of time for frontline social workers, but my time diminishes as they go up the ladder to some extent, because as you go up the ladder, you have to balance budgets more. But I'm often telling senior social workers that my client doesn't have to care for her 20-year-old learning disabled son. You know, we abolished the liable family rule on the 5th of July 1948, Ducky, and it's not my client's duty. We said it was the state's duty to care for elderly, ill and disabled people. And that's how it should be, because it's a card that you are, you know, it's a wild card. Some people go through life without any caring whatsoever, and some people spend their life caring. Some people go through life without any caring responsibilities at all and end up saying their hard-earned cash should be kept for them and their children, and they should be able to, you know, do what they like with it. But we forget hard-working, caring families who never work in the paid sense, but spend their life caring, and then, of course, have a future of poverty, because they don't get paid for that, they don't get proper social security benefits, and they don't have a pension to rely on. So we said it's the state's duty to cover that issue. When we abolished the liable family rule, of course, carers didn't stop caring, because it's a fact of humanity that we do it. In fact, as I've already said, we have more carers today than we've ever had. We've got 6.5 million carers in the United Kingdom, far more than 20 years ago. Because although we've abolished the liable family rule, you do not have to care for adult family members, even your spouse. The state has slowly withdrawn those services, but people have always cared, and they will always care. Even in the modern welfare states of Northern Europe, there's a huge amount of caring, because that's what we do. It's hardwired into nearly all of us. So the good old National Assistance Act abolishes the liable family rule. The state does it. So every carer's assessment should start with a statement that the assessing authorities, the social services authority, do not assume, they make no assumption that the carer is willing or able to provide or continue to provide care, because they simply don't have to do it. And so the question is, this is what this disabled person needs, this elderly person, this ill person needs. This is the care package they would need. What are you willing or able to do to help provide this care plan, basically? And so carers often say, well, I'm happy to do this, this and this, but I can't do that, or whatever. We'll look at that. And that's what the state's obligation is. The state looks at the totality of need, and then it discusses with the carers which bits of that they're prepared to do, they're willing to do, they're able to do. And the state has the underpinning responsibility. Now, the National Assistance Act, lovely act that it is a relic of what it was. Today it is only to do with providing residential care. So in nearly every situation, with hardly any exception, with a few exceptions, whenever a social services authority places an adult in a care home, a registered care home, they will be doing that under the National Assistance Act 1948, Section 21. So why you need to know?